The U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine is in Kyiv. Kellogg conceding he is there to hear the concerns of a country now almost 3 years into a full-scale invasion from Russia. Mr. Kellogg will meet the Ukrainian president and the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces and share his findings with the U.S. president. Kyiv has repeatedly stressed it needs Washington to deliver security guarantees sufficient to deter Moscow from launching a new invasion after a peace deal is reached. Mr. Kellogg's arrival comes a day after the U.S. president appeared to blame Mr. Zelenskyy for starting the war. And even as top U.S. and Russian diplomats talk terms without including Ukraine or the European Union, they agreed yesterday to form teams to negotiate an end to the war. Ukraine's concerns about being left out of key talks have been dismissed by U.S. President Donald Trump. And for more, we're joined by Stuart Smith reporting live from Kyiv. Stuart, Mr. Zelenskyy, how has he reacted to Mr. Trump criticizing how Ukraine has allowed this war to continue for the last few years?
In a morning press conference, he said that with all due respect to President Donald Trump, he is living in Russian disinformation space, as evidenced, President Zelenskyy claims, by the fact that the United States has helped Russia end its isolation on the global stage, and also by a statement that Donald Trump made suggesting that President Zelenskyy's approval rating here in Ukraine is at 4%, something that Kyiv claims is direct Russian disinformation that they are aware is being spread by Moscow to the United States officials, delegation, and also to the US more broadly. He quotes figures that suggest it is, while debated in Ukraine as to whether President Zelenskyy can be trusted to lead the country, a very different picture. He suggested the figures that he's looking at, which come from the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, suggest for the first half of February 2025, 50% of Ukrainians trust President Zelenskyy and 37% do not, leading to the author of that study at that Kyiv Institute suggesting that while it is up for Ukrainians to debate the legitimacy of the president, there is nothing that should give any cause for concern for international leaders, clearly aimed particularly at this time to the United States. Also in this press conference, President Zelenskyy rubbished the $500 billion figure that Washington says it puts on any potential profit-sharing scheme of Ukrainian resource extraction. Zelenskyy laid out the maths that he says that Kyiv is working on. The US supplied $67 billion in weapons, he said, $32 billion in budget support, way short of that $500 billion figure quoted by the United States. He says, I cannot sell our country. As to how long Ukraine, though, can survive without the help of the United States, a question that is becoming ever more important as there appears to be a wedge driving between Washington and Kyiv. President Zelenskyy said that Putin wants to occupy Ukraine. He definitely won't be able to, but without American support, Ukraine definitely can't win.
Well, Stuart, Mr. Trump is known for taking extreme positions on a single issue and therefore finding a moderate compromise when he reaches that deal. So, of course, he's sending his special envoy, Kellogg, who is in Kyiv, who is striking a softer tone. Kellogg saying he is in Ukraine to listen to concerns. Could there be anything that Mr. Kellogg can bring back to Mr. Trump that could change what seems to be rising tensions between the two?
There's skepticism about what role the general can play here in Kyiv. While he is the designated official from Washington to pass on Kyiv's concerns to the White House, he has so far been sidelined when it comes to the direct negotiations with Russia. Now, he says that's deliberate. It's part of a two-track approach. Some officials dealing with Moscow, he and other officials dealing with Ukraine. He says, indeed, his role here is to listen and then pass on the concerns of President Zelenskyy. But there's concern that in Kyiv, the issue here is not Donald Trump not hearing Ukraine's concerns, but ignoring them. Now, President Zelenskyy hopes that perhaps by showing General Kellogg the front line in Ukraine, that by talking to him throughout this, what appears to be a 3-day trip, he might be able to convince the general to pass on some new information to Donald Trump that could help him change his mind. Volodymyr Zelenskyy inviting him to talk to residents of Kyiv while he's here, but uncertainty as to whether this is just for show, to show that the United States is still engaging with Ukraine, and whether the Ukraine's envoy to Washington has any potential chance of changing the direction of these talks.
Oh, thanks. That's Stuart Smith reporting live there from Kyiv. Of course, the US Special Envoy Kellogg is in Ukraine, as we just heard, to listen to the concerns of the government there. Meanwhile, European Union nations have agreed on a new round of sanctions on Russia. Will Denselow joins us live from Brussels with more details on that. Divisions between Washington and Kyiv, but also between Washington and the European Union. European Union slapping these sanctions on Russia, even as Washington is reaching out with direct talks with Moscow. How significant are these new penalties from Europe?
Well, we've heard from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen after this 16th raft of sanctions was announced. She said that essentially this is an effort to further close loopholes to stop Russia from circumventing existing sanctions programs. That is why von der Leyen says that Russia's so-called shadow fleet has been targeted. It's estimated that over 70 vessels that have been used to export Russian oil are being targeted. So that is one key area that is being explored in this raft of sanctions. Another one is a ban on the import of Russian unwrought aluminium. Now, this goes beyond the existing sanctions on things like aluminium wiring, aluminium piping, aluminium tubing. So an effort to, again, hurt the coffers in Moscow. Now, I've heard just a few minutes ago, I'm speaking to you from the European Parliament here in Brussels, and speaking to a member of the European Parliament a few moments ago about this raft of sanctions. She told me she's disappointed that there have been 16 sanctions packages over the past 3 years since the full-scale invasion. She'd have rather just one. She also says that since this discussion between the US and Russian officials, that highlights the need for Europe to act even more strongly, not just for the security of Ukraine, but for Europe too.
European leaders, they met earlier this week, essentially to deal with this very sharp shift in relations between the US and the EU on the one hand, and the US and Russia on the other, but divided over, for example, possible troop deployment in Ukraine. Now, they're holding another round, that's European leaders, another round of emergency talks on security and Ukraine. Is this their way of trying to manage what would be perhaps a less than surprising shift in relations between Washington and Brussels?
A message we've heard from the EU's top diplomat and foreign affairs chief, Kaja Kallas, is that it's imperative for Europe and Kyiv's allies to not fall into the traps set by Russia, and must not fall into their traps when it comes to disunity. They say that there must be a strong partnership that remains between Washington and Brussels and the rest of Ukraine's allies going forward. And yes, there are certainly concerns that at this stage, Europe has not been a part of these negotiations between Russia and the US. A message is very clear from European officials across the continent, including in Ukraine's capital, that both Kyiv and European powers must be privy to these negotiations going forward. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, has said that when we enter the stage of meaningful negotiations, then yes, Europe will be a part of that because of the sanctions that the EU has put in place, as well as other European allies. So that, though, is still an area of concern. That is why European powers met on Monday. That is why even more of Ukraine's allies are convening in Paris today for further discussions. On Monday, the conversation was largely on defence spending. We can expect that to dominate proceedings yet again in Paris.
Thanks. Will Denselow live there from Brussels.